Okay, I think we're good. Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everybody today?
Good.
Yeah, we've been talking about the weather. It's beautiful outside. Sure, I can. I know that Clinton has a visitor this morning. I don't know. I don't want to shut it in case somebody else comes, all the way and think, oh, well, Yvette. There we go. Mary.
Is that enough?
No.
No. Let me just get up. Let's leave that one open.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Now we're ready. So we're still in Esther. We're getting close to the end here. We are going to tackle 3 chapters this morning. Chapters 5, 6, and 7. We are centering our studies around all of these feasts, right? Xerxes had a feast in chapter 1. Vashti had her own feast in chapter 1. Esther, then, there was a feast made for Esther in chapter 2. And then we talked about in chapter 3 this very brief one-liner in there. Xerxes and Haman had their feast, right? Had their own banquet. And today, though, we're going to talk about the feasts that are for Xerxes and Haman. Last week, the feast was just Xerxes and Haman's own special thing. But today, the feasts are for Xerxes and Haman. I've outlined today's class centered around 3 key players, the queen, the king, and Haman. And then we'll make some concluding remarks after that. So first, let's talk about the queen. There is a bunch that happens in these 3 chapters. So instead of taking them verse by verse or chapter by chapter, I want to talk about these 3 people, the queen, the king, and Haman. So with the queen, we're going to talk about Queen Esther in the court, Queen Esther at the banquet day 1, and Queen Esther at the banquet, right? Okay, so those are our 3 main points for Queen Esther in these 3 chapters. Okay, so first of all, Queen Esther in the court. This is chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. First, Esther is prepared. Did anybody read these verses and think, okay, while she was fasting for those 3 days, this must be what she had been thinking about. This must be the plan that she determined in her mind. So she's prepared. She and her people have fasted. She has a plan, obviously, because when she goes in to make her request, there's a banquet already being prepared for the king that I am assuming she is hoping for a positive response, right? She's prepared as if she's going to get a positive response. And so she, and not only that, but apparently, I'm assuming, had to make preparations for the second banquet ahead of time, right? So I think maybe the queen had all this planned out should she get that audience with the king. All right, so she's prepared. Next, Esther, we read here, publicly confronts the king. She faces her moment of truth, and she appears in the court of the king unsummoned, right? We all know what that means. If you come in unsummoned and you're not accepted, that's a capital offense, as if you committed murder. It's a capital offense. It meant the death penalty. But she takes, I think what's most important here is that she takes full advantage of her identity as the queen of Persia. She comes in decked to the nines, right? She knows what she's doing, and she uses that power in order to influence the king, right? So she appears in her royal robes, according to the text. And I think that is a huge statement obviously she's queen, but she is fully taking on her authority and her power by coming in dressed like this. Of course, she's beautiful already. We already know that, right? She already won the king's heart once, not even in royal robes, right? She came to him, in whatever she was wearing, but not in royal robes. And so she comes dressed to the hilt here, and it works, right? And she invites the two men. Let me rephrase that. The king asks what she wants, extends the scepter.
I'm sorry.
Extends the scepter, asks what she wants, and she invites the two most powerful men in the kingdom to a banquet. Okay. To a feast in their honor. Instead of, right off the bat, making her request, either for Haman's head or for her people or whatever, she invites instead the two most powerful men in the kingdom to a feast in their honor. Why do you think she did that?
So she could have them together at the same time
Okay, yes,
when she brings this up, the problem of the Jews.
right.
To
I
the
think
king.
this is all part of her plan, right? Yeah, very good. Yeah.
That and wine.
That and wine, yeah, very good. I no doubt she's showing respect. Respect is a big one here. She is showing respect to the two most powerful men in the kingdom by doing this. She wants to honor them. Will be putting herself in a more acceptable position, favorable opportunity to actually get what she's after here, what she's wanting, right? She's going to be in her domain, right? Her banquet. Everything's under her control in that sense, I guess, and so there are some things to think about there. So that's Queen Esther in the court. Next, Queen Esther at the banquet, day 1. This is just chapter 5, verses 5 through 8. Day 1, we don't have a whole lot of information from it. But the thing that we do know is that she heightens the suspense here, doesn't she? The king asks her a second time, but she doesn't make her request known, even at this banquet. And she invites the men to another feast. Okay, I think she takes a risk here with time. Anything can happen within the next 24 hours, right? Especially considering the two men we're talking about, Xerxes, the king, and Haman. I mean, he's, out there. He's unpredictable. And so I think that, she does take a risk, but of course the risk we know proves to be profitable. But, anything could happen. The king could have changed his mood, could have changed his mind, could have gotten sick, or could have had a sleepless night. All right, okay, but she didn't know any of that. And then, of course, Haman, too. He had an extra day to be Haman and wreak further havoc however he wanted to, right? So there was a risk, I think. But nonetheless, she does certainly heighten the suspense, and for whatever reason, she chose to not make her request here at the first day. She extends it to a second day, and the king and Haman agree to come, and of course Haman is so excited about it, but we'll get to him in a minute. But I want us to fast forward with Queen Esther to the banquet on the second day. This is chapter 7. Here is where we get so much more information about what's happening at this banquet. Here now she faces a very delicate and dangerous task. She has to accuse Haman but not incriminate the king, right? Because that would be dangerous. If she accused the king, right, she can't do that, but she's got to somehow accuse Haman but not incite the king or incriminate the king, and then also not incite the king against his closest advisor. I mean, Haman's in second in command here, and Xerxes put him there for some reason, must like him a little bit. And so now the queen's got to be careful with that. relationship and can't just incite the king against him unnecessarily and then bring wrath upon herself. Right? Okay. So I think that's the balance she's trying to strike here. It's a risky, delicate thing that she's dealing with. But I find it interesting in verse 3 that when the queen finally answered the king, because the king makes his request a third time in chapter 7, verse 2, and do you remember his wording? What is your petition and what is your request? Right? Okay, so when she answers, she uses the king's rhetoric in the same way. When he says, what's your petition, what's your request? That's one and the same thing, meaning what is your one desire that I can do for you? Right? He's not asking, what two things can I do for you? He's asking, what is your one desire I can do for you? So she puts it together and uses his rhetoric and answers in that way and says, well, here's my petition, here's my request. My petition is let my life be given to me. And then my request, and my people. In other words, she is intertwining her life with her people. They are one and the same in this situation. So I think that's wise, smart, brilliant, if you ask me, because there's a lot of things going on here. I mean, her life is at risk as queen. All the Jews are at risk here. Haman she's got to deal with him. So you see all these things, and then she's got to be sure to be careful not to, be careful with the king. But I think she does it brilliantly, using even the king's rhetoric here. And so she intertwines her life with her people, meaning, they're one and the same. Their destinies are intertwined, I guess. Okay, so I think that's pretty brilliant of Queen Esther. And so she explains in verse 4. She says, I and my people are to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Those are the exact words of the edict that Haman came up with and that the king agreed to by giving Haman his signet ring. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And so she quotes the edict, but she refrains from using Haman's name or the king's. Right, but she quotes it. And then she says, had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. Okay, so I want to just take a moment here with the latter part of this verse, because I don't know about you, but that was a little enigmatic to me. What does she mean there? Mm-hmm. Okay, I had to give it some thought. I had to read it in some other versions. The ESV says, we had been sold into slavery. I would have kept silent if I would have been sold into, if it would have just been us sold into slavery. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. So that's the ESV version.
His loss of honor, because he's going to have to go back on his word. So it would kind of be like a embarrassment to him to have to do that.
To do what?
To go back on his edict that he's already signed.
Okay.
But if
So
she
it
had
would
been
be a
sold
loss
with her
of
people
face.
into slavery, he would lose his
He would
queen.
lose his queen, and
So that's his loss. Right? I mean, that would be a big loss.
Sure.
and all of his slaves and people who work.
Well,
So
it's still be
evident.
slaves.
Well, I meant as far as they were concerned, the Jews were below them, so they were the workers. And if they all left, who's going to work for them?
Okay, so I think, those are all, that's what we're trying to do here is think through this, because it's a little bit, it's not explained, in other words, what she exactly meant. Mm-hmm. And so we have to take the words as they've been translated to us, mm-hmm. and try to get a good understanding of what she may have meant by this. I can't help but think that she may be appealing to, because you remember Haman promised a huge chunk of money into the treasury. And so I can't help but think that she's including that in here. And saying that if you lose us, your economy is going to suffer. You're going to take a big hit, bigger than bigger or big as the hit you took, trying to win Greece. And so Haman could never make up for the king's loss if we were sold as slaves.
So the 10,000 wouldn't be.
Yeah, it
much
wouldn't
compared
even,
to-
no, right. Even what he promised to put in wouldn't even compare to what the king would actually lose if they were sold as slaves. Now, let alone dead, right? Okay. So I think she's trying to say to the king, this is a lose-lose situation for you. But in her way, her subtle way, right? She's not telling him straight out. You know what I'm saying? She's not being domineering, I guess, or forceful about it. She's using the king's rhetoric. She's using the edict that he signed or, gave his approval for. And she's using what probably he treasured most, which was his treasury, with him here in these two sentences. Right?
This is gonna sound bad, but like it's almost how we women have a way of saying things to men by using certain things to where they have somehow decided that it was their idea. But we're able to
Sure.
Direct.
weave our words in such ways that we're
Right.
not leaving them feeling like we have demanded something, told them something.
Yep.
It's just a
I think
lesson we
that's
have.
right.
It is like
I think-
them through the
Yeah.
thoughts.
I think that's a
It's like
good,
suggestion.
it could be a very good skill
Yeah.
I
to
think
have.
that might be part of the reason why she's done this slowly and in stages.
Sure, sure. I think so
Little
too.
bit, little bit.
Just
It's
And
not as
just
a,
come in
lead them to the water.
like
Yeah.
I do.
and it's not as abrupt as Vashti, who just flat out
Exactly.
refused.
Right.
And along the lines of what Haley was saying, but you have some very skillful women who take it very far, right? And they wreak havoc in their families, in their
Well,
work,
I
and
think
things like
sometimes
that.
it
But
just crosses the line into manipulation.
yes,
As opposed to
very good.
just
Yes.
helping.
Yes, aiding the situations along. Yeah, very good. Okay, well, I think she's aiding the situation and doing it brilliantly here. And so that's the queen. Okay, so that's pretty much all we're going to talk about her. But now let's talk about the king. So we're going to talk about the king now in the court, the king at the banquet day one, but now the king between the banquets, because something very significant happens there, and then the king at the banquet day two. So we've got 4 points for the king. So first off, King Xerxes in the court. This is chapter 5. We're back over there. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. We know that Xerxes, for whatever reason, accepts the queen and extends his golden scepter to her. Was it her beauty that overcame him once again? Was it his curiosity? Remember, she hasn't seen the king in 30 days. So perhaps it was both. He kind of, forgot about her a little bit, and then she appears in all her glory here and splendor, and he's like, wow, right? And he wants now, and then his curiosity, well, I wonder what she wants, right? There's got to be something good in it for me, maybe. So, maybe it was both of those things. It works. And then Xerxes offers her up to half the kingdom. Okay, I hope we know that that's not a literal, he didn't mean that literally.
Yeah.
It was just, it's an idiom, hyperbole idiom to show his grace, his, what did I put here, generosity. Herod did this in Mark 6. Was it Mark 6? Yes, Herod did this in Mark 6. And then, of course, remember, that's when John the Baptizer's head was requested. Okay. So that's the king in the court. Pretty simple. King Xerxes at the banquet day one. This is just what the verses we've already looked at. Chapter 5, verses 5 through 8. It mentions here the banquet of wine. So it's my understanding that the feasting occurred first, and then following the feast there was the wines or wine or whatever, as like a dessert probably, or, I don't know what else you would call it. But anyway, so this is kind of after they've already eaten, in other words, when it says in verse 6, at the banquet of wine. I think this is just to indicate that they're full and merry, perhaps. So perhaps his heart was merry with wine once again, and he asks Esther a second time, what is your petition? What is your request? Okay, so that's day 1, banquet day 1. And then we want to move forward to chapter 6. This is the time in between the banquets. Something really major here happens, and I really think this might be the climax and turning point of the entire book here. It just so happens that the king can't sleep that night. So the Chronicles, it says, the book of the records of the Chronicles were brought and read before the king. That ought to put him to sleep. But anyway, and then it just so happens that one of the excerpts that was read was about Mordecai saving the king's life. And the king says, well, what was done to honor him? And they say, oh, well, nothing was done. Oh, okay. Well, this changes everything, right? This is, Okay. So then Haman enters just at the right time, right? He's got his own agenda, but he shows up early in the morning, apparently, in order to be sure to get an audience with the king, to get his task done before the banquet. He's on a mission. He's got to get rid of Mordecai. And he just wants to have the best time he can at this feast with the king and the queen. But Mordecai's his thorn in the flesh, so he's got to get rid of him. So he's there early. But instead of being able to make his request, the king makes a request of Haman, right? This is verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? All right. So at first we might think, well, how unfortunate that the king asked, of all people, Haman, what to do to honor Mordecai. I mean, Haman, right?
His right-hand man,
Oh, I know that. Yes, very good. But the king is obviously unaware
right?
of the deep animosity and hatred that Haman has for Mordecai. He's oblivious to any of that.
I would love to saw his face.
Exactly.
So Haman believed, of course, that the honors were for him because he was, after all, the king's number 2. And so what more could Haman ask for as second in command? He requests the only thing I think that's left. I mean, he's already got wealth and luxury. He's not lacking anything. But now I think he requests the king's own power and prestige and presence, right? That's what he doesn't have. And so that's why he requests the royal robe, the royal horse, to be paraded, and then for it to be shouted that this is what the king does to the men he delights to honor. Okay, so this would all reinforce Haman's relationship with the king, right? It would make him look really, really good. All right, so that's really what happens there in between the banquets with the king. Okay, we'll talk more about Haman when we get to him. But now, lastly, let's talk about the king at the banquet day 2. This is chapter 7, of course. So the king asks Esther a third time, what is your petition? What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. Perhaps, like we said, his heart was merry with wine once again. And when Esther makes her request, right, in verse 4, the king responds in verse 5 and says, who is he? And where is he? The one who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing. He's already pretty angry, right? You could hear it in the words. It doesn't even say that he's angry, but yeah, who is this and where is he? I'm going to get him, in other words. Why would he say that if he didn't mean that? So he is already angered at this situation that the queen presents before him, and he obviously doesn't remember the occasion that caused him to give a signet ring to Haman in order to make this decree. He doesn't remember Haman talking about this certain people who have their own laws, who don't keep the king's laws, right? Okay,
He didn't realize that was Esther's people.
What's that?
He didn't realize that
Oh
was
yeah,
Esther's
no.
people.
He has no idea, and he obviously doesn't remember Lanile. I mean, that was exact wording from the edict. Okay, he didn't remember. But he's ready to execute wrath on this unjust and horrifying situation. We get that. That was his response. So then, when she reveals in verse 6, the adversary and enemy, I love the words she uses here. The adversary, the enemy, this wicked Haman. So she reveals she reveals who it is, and of course where he is. He's just right there. Okay. So she reveals who it is, and of course it says Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And then verse 7, this is how the king responded to the truth about his second in command. He arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went out into the palace garden. So he storms out in a rage into the garden. I read one commentator write, I wonder what he was thinking about out there. Did it then dawn on him that maybe he remembered a little bit about this? That he had a small part in that? This commentator said, these questions were circulating in Xerxes' mind. Can he punish Haman for a plot he himself approved? Okay. If he does so, won't he have to admit his own role in the whole fiasco and then lose face? And moreover, he's already issued an irrevocable law, right? So how can he rescind that? Okay, so I don't know if he was even thinking any of that when he was out there. What's that?
He's too mad.
Yeah, who knows what he was thinking out there. But it doesn't matter. Here's the bottom line. It doesn't even matter what he was thinking out there. Because as soon as he walks back in and sees Haman's folly, it's all over.
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter what he was thinking out there. Okay, so he returns, right? Verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, he saw Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. And what does he assume when he says, the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? Mm-hmm. What does he assume the king Haman's doing to the queen? Mm-hmm. Sexually assaulting her. Yes, absolutely. I think so. Yes, no one is left alone with the king's women. That was just law in Persia. Maybe law other places too, but nobody's left alone. If you happen to find yourself in a room and are left alone, you are to leave the room, apparently. But Haman is stuck here between a rock and a hard place because he's either alone with the queen, which is against the law, or he leaves, runs away, and that already proves his guilt even more, and then it's a whole manhunt. So he's stuck, right? So he's just he's desperate, right? He's pleading for his life here with the queen on the couch. He's trapped, I guess. I even read somewhere that nobody was even allowed within 7 paces of the king's women. This was like harem rules in Persia. You couldn't even be within 7 steps of any of the king's women. So here he is to fall on her couch. That's just unthinkable. And so the king is furious, even more than he originally was. And I think that when the words say they covered Haman's face, I think they killed him right then. I don't think that we think they put a bag over his head and took him out, and I'll explain all that in just a minute. Because of, well, let's talk about that in a second. Well, I don't know, maybe I should put it in right here. I do think that they execute Haman on the spot here, and I think that's what is meant by covering his face. because in verse 9, Harbona, right, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, there's these the gallows that Haman has made. Okay, well, I guess I can talk about it here. Let me make sure I get over my notes, because I have it somewhere else in my notes. I don't want to mess it up. Okay, yes, so when we think of gallows, what do we think of? We think of a hangman's noose, right? Dying by asphyxiation with a noose and being hung there. But apparently that's not, the Hebrew word here doesn't have an actual English word that fits what it means. It means to impale. Yes, on a spike. And so apparently after they're already dead, they don't even die on it. It's to be a display. They're to be eaten by the birds, the animals, whatever. It's they're just not worthy of a burial. Right? Okay, but they're already dead when they go onto the spike, and I think we'll see that as we read through the text here some more. But so that's why I think that they, however, killed him. I don't know if didn't chop his head off, probably. I don't know, maybe, but they killed him somehow really quick, covered him because he was dead, and drug him out. And then, of course, says, okay, well, now go put him on the stake over there. And so they impale him so everybody can see the disgrace and shame of Haman.
Talk about how high it is.
Okay, yeah. Well, because, Haman built this thing like 75.
So he was going to hang.
He was going to impale Mordecai on it.
Oh, impale him on it. Okay.
Yes. He was going to, it was a platform with a spike.
Okay.
So that you could put the body on it and everybody could see it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because we think of gallows as.
Well, they walk up and.
Yeah. And then you kill them there on the gallows. But more than from what I understand historically, people were already dead and then impaled on spikes.
That's why even later on when Jesus is crucified, that's what they normally did, was just leave him on the cross.
To die.
Even after they were dead.
Oh,
but they
okay.
allowed Jesus to be taken down, but they left him as a warning to the people. That's
I got you. Yeah.
So even further, and then even in England, the Queen Elizabeth had them all on heads, all on things outside.
It was a warning, usually.
Yeah.
If you're going to behave like that, this is what's going to happen to you, right? Okay. All right, so that's what happens here, I think. He's immediately killed, and then, of course, Harbona has this great idea and says, oh, look, there's the gallows that Haman made. Go put him on that. And the king's like, yeah, go put him on that. So then they hanged Haman, stuck him on the spike that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then it says, at the end of verse 10, then the king's wrath subsided. This reminds me, I don't know if it did you, but it reminds me of remember when in chapter 2, verse 1, where it said that after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti. And he didn't have a queen. And he was like, oh, I need a queen, right? So I don't know. It's just, there's some flashbacks here, I think, that we get a little bit. But that's all I was going to say about that.
He's impulsive.
But he's the king.
He's the king. Yeah, he can do whatever he wants.
Yep.
Anyway, but it's just kind of funny. Then the king's wrath subsided. Like, oh, he felt better now. He's no longer angry. It's all taken care of. Yeah. Okay, so that was the king. Now let's talk about Haman, the most colorful character, I think, we've got here. Okay, so I have Haman after, do I have after? Yeah, after the banquet, day 1. Haman before the banquet, day 2, and then Haman at the banquet, day 2. So 3 points about Haman. So Haman, number 1, Haman after the banquet. Instead of at the banquet, day 1, let's talk about Haman after the banquet, because that's really what's said most about him. So this is chapter 5, verses 9 through 14. Haman after the banquet. I have 2 points here. Number 1, happiness is fleeting. He went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. So he went out that day joyful and with a glad heart after he left the feast, but his smile was quickly turned upside down when Mordecai still refused to bow. And so he placates himself at home by calling his friends and his wife in order to recant to him his every success, right? But even when he does all that, he still can't shake Mordecai from his mind. It's that one thing. Everything else is going perfectly in his life but that one thing. We talked about that last week. So happiness is fleeting. We understand the principle of that. This life is not about our happiness. Happiness will fly away with the wind on occasion, right? I'm glad when I'm happy and feel great about everything. But contentment, right? That's what we're all after here. Contentment is the best thing. But happiness is fleeting. Next, happiness at all cost. That was, I think, Haman's MO. Happiness at all cost. His company of friends and his wife know just what to say to make him feel better, don't they? That's why he called them. I'm sure they've done it before. All right. So they know just what to say to make him feel better and say, off with Mordecai before the feast so that you can be happy again. Right? Yes? Off with Mordecai, but make sure you do it before the feast so you can be happy again. There's really just not any conscience in these people, right? I don't think any of them have a conscience. This doesn't matter about a life or a soul or a being or, it's just whatever you need to do to make you happy, right? That's a popular thing even today,
Huge thing today.
right? Do what makes you happy.
At whatever cost.
Yeah, oh yeah, of course. No conscience. I think I'm afraid for us as a nation
Yeah,
of
for sure.
people who are becoming a people without a conscience.
Isn't
That's
something that
scary.
bothered me for a long time is parents whose adult children make bad choices and they'll say, well, it wasn't right, but they're happy.
Oh,
You
yeah.
cannot be happy for your children when they're lost.
I
You
know.
cannot.
Yeah.
I mean, you can be happy for things, but in the big picture, you cannot go, they're happy,
Yeah,
because that doesn't work.
I agree. Yep, I agree. Yes,
think
it's
they're happy.
dangerous.
They think they're happy.
Yeah, and that's good. Happiness can be false feeling, right? And everybody has their own idea of what happiness is, and everybody who has ever tried to pursue only happiness will usually at the end of it go, yeah, that's not gonna, there's got to be something deeper here. This isn't working out for me. Solomon did that, right? He pursued all the avenues of happiness and came to the conclusion, none of this was worth anything. It's to seek and serve your Creator. From the days of your youth, do it. That's the only thing that matters in this life that's important, that extends beyond this life. Okay, so we see here, they just say they are without conscience here, and, they're ready to hang or kill Mordecai too. And this is where I make the point about the gallows. So he does make these gallows, as my version says. Is that what the ESV says too, gallows? Yeah.
Well, I don't have ESV, but I'm sure yes. That's what it
Yeah.
says.
It does.
So he makes them really big, makes it really big so that it can be seen. That's the whole point of this thing. He's a big personality, Haman, right? And so he doesn't do anything small. He does everything big. And so he makes this, it says how many cubits? 50 cubits maybe?
50 cubits.
Which I guess is, if a cubit is about 18 inches, that's about 75 feet, I guess. Okay, so that was Haman after the banquet, day 1. And then we have Haman before the banquet, day 2. And this, of course, we've already talked about this a little bit. I call this a presumption sandwich. A presumption sandwich. Here, this is chapter 6, verses 4 through 14. Because Haman presumes that the king is talking about him, right? Selfish people only think of themselves. And this is what Haman is doing in verse 6. But in this sandwich, I'll get to the other presumption piece of bread. So there's presumption at the first where he thinks the king's talking about him, and then we'll have another piece of the bread here in just a second. But between the sandwich, we have pride. right? Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before a fall and a haughty spirit. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Okay. Well, and how great was Haman's fall? I don't know about you, but when the king gets done, or when Haman gets done saying all these things that should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor, and then the king in verse 10 says, hurry then, take the robe, take the horse, just as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. I mean, I picture the cartoon where the jaw drops entirely to the floor, right? I mean, that's, yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, so his pride, he fell really far here. And then he was just utterly put to shame. It was utter humiliation for Haman. He has to now dress Mordecai. He's got to touch him. He's got to get close to him. He's got to dress Mordecai in the royal robes. He's got to make sure he gets safely on the horse. He's got to lead the horse through the town. And then he has to say words. So he's just humiliated completely. But I mean, he deserves it, right? That's what he gets for presuming. So his pride, he's put to shame. He runs home mourning, right? The text says, pouting, probably. Because of this very public humiliation. And just as a little side note here about Mordecai, I mean, can you put yourself in Mordecai's shoes? After all this happens, he's like, okay, that was weird. And then he goes back to the king's gate and just goes back to work like, okay, what just happened? You know, I mean, you can, because maybe he thought, okay, maybe this is for that time when 5 years ago, was it, years ago that I did this. I don't know. It doesn't say, of course, but, you kind of think about Mordecai and this happening to him and being like, okay, well, that was weird. And then he just goes back to work. But Haman, of course, this just breaks him. And so this is the other side of this, the other piece of bread here with the presumption sandwich. He then presumes, he tells all his friends, right, about what has happened, his wife, and he presumes they're going to come up with another brilliant idea probably to remedy his sadness, right? Surely he expected another brilliant solution to make him feel better because they've done it before. So this is the presumption sandwich. But instead what happens? Oh, yeah. Their words are instead a dark foreshadowing, right? They said, and they use pretty strong wording here. They say, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him. So 3 times they say this with certainty, that he's going to fail. Which brings to our minds, well, why did they say this all of a sudden? What did they see here? Did they realize the significance of the Jewish people here finally? Or is it just that, okay, now Mordecai's the second in command to the king and you can't go against him? Or is it both? Okay, he's a Jew, and I don't know if they had any notion of Yahweh, the God of the Jews. I mean, the Persians had their own gods, right? They had their own pantheon of gods. But I don't know, of course, the text doesn't indicate that either. I don't know if they knew that the Jews worshiped one God, and maybe they had heard some history of this one very powerful God, right, in Israel's history. I don't know. But they do know that this Mordecai for sure is no longer insignificant. He's very significant, and he's been highly honored by the king. So we do know that much, that at least they knew that. And it's enough for them to say, look, you're not going to win. You're not going to win. At least they were honest, I guess. It didn't help Haman at all. And then very quickly, verse 14, while they were still talking, the chariot arrives to bring Haman to the feast, right? Or whatever. They came to pick him up really quickly. So we see this is moving really, really fast for Haman. He's undergoing a lot of emotions, all in the span of probably just a few hours here. Okay, and so finally Haman at the banquet, chapter 7. We already know what happens here. The queen calls him out as an adversary, an enemy, as wicked. He is terrified. Some more emotions here, right? He pleads for his life. He falls on her couch, and then it's the end. He's executed. That was it. And then, of course, we assume that they did take him out and put him. Oh, they did. Verse 10. They hanged him for sure, or impaled him on the gallows. And that's the end of Haman. Yes.
Do you think that maybe his family there, if Mordecai was like aware of his hatred for Haman, dating back, or his refusal to honor Haman because he was an Agagite, do you think that could be reversed, that the family knew that and now they said,
oh yeah,
the Jews
maybe so
are going back, you're gone.
If they were familiar with any of the Jewish history, then perhaps.
I would say if one was, the other was.
Oh yeah,
that's
maybe
my
so.
thinking of
maybe
it.
so.
And that would make perfect sense then of why
Sure.
they would say Jews are back in charge.
Perhaps. Or at least the God of Israel is here, present in this land.
Yeah.
Because he was very present in Egypt. He was very present in Canaan land. Even
very present.
Yeah, okay. Yes, so,
And everything.
right, yeah, so perhaps. So that was Haman. So now just some concluding remarks about some of these things. I'll begin with the last one I have on here just because we're just talked about Haman, but the whole idea of reaping what you sow. Haman did that, right? I have some verses here. Of course, this comes from Galatians 6:7. God's not mocked. Don't be deceived about that. You can't fool God. You're going to reap what you sow. That's just a truth statement. Proverbs 22:8 reminds me of Haman. He who sows iniquity will reap sorrow, and the rod of his anger will fail. Does that remind you of Haman? He was angry, right? Proverbs 14:14, the backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways. That's Haman. But a good man will be satisfied from above. Proverbs 5:22, his own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. That reminds me of Haman.
Yes.
Okay, and then I found this quote by Josephus. We all know who Josephus was, right? First century historian. He wrote this about Haman and God. He said, bear with the language here because, I mean, it's antiquity. It's antiquated, but and from hence I cannot forbear to admire God, and to learn hence his wisdom and justice, not only in punishing the wickedness of Haman, but in so disposing it, that he should undergo the very same punishment which he had contrived for another, as also because thereby he teaches others this lesson, that what mischiefs any one prepares against another, he, without knowing of it, first contrives it against himself.
What goes around comes around.
Yes,
Is that what he said?
the golden rule: treating others how you wanted to be want to be treated. That kind of thing. So we reap what we sow. That's very self-evident. But I think one of the most important things we learn from this situation here, in chapters 5 through 7, is that where King Saul failed. Remember, what was his one task? Completely destroy the Amalekites. Don't spare anyone, man, woman, child, animal, anything. But instead, King Saul had pity or whatever on the king. Agag, right? Okay. So where King Saul failed, the Queen Esther, was successful. King Saul failed in destroying the King Agag. We do know Samuel eventually took that matter into his own hands and he took care of business. But Queen Esther here takes matters into her own hands, doesn't she? She steps up and she was very successful by carefully exposing the offender and not standing in the way of justice, I think. All right, so then that brings me to this next really big lesson I think we learned from this. When duty calls, take up the power of your position as a child of God. It's the most important position you have. You have special access to the throne of God in prayer because of Christ. Every spiritual blessing you have because of what Christ has done. We are in a very powerful position as children of God in this world, and I think we have a duty, a responsibility to take that mantle up and take it seriously. Hadassah comes into her own as Queen Esther only after she decides to align herself with the covenant people of God. Remember, we talked about the queen. We talked about Esther having these two identities, right? An identity crisis of sorts that comes to this, where she's got to decide, right? She's got to make a decision here. And so Hadassah, the Jewish girl, right? The Jewish virgin versus the queen, Esther. She finally comes into her own after she aligns herself with God's people, with God and his covenant. She no longer is just a trophy wife to the king. She's no longer a queen in name only. But she puts on those royal robes in the defense of her people, not the Persian people. And she takes up the power of her position for the sake of her people and her God. I think that's a big lesson that we learned here. I do think that the writer here in this book is not trying to portray for us an Esther according to her personal character, because we don't get a whole lot of that. But that the writer's trying to portray to us an Esther according to her royal power and the influence that she has. Therefore, I don't think that Esther is portrayed in this book as the ideal woman who is a woman after God's own heart, like David, right? Even though that phrase was assigned to him or given, was said about him. I don't think that Esther here is portrayed as some, like you wouldn't teach your daughters,
Right.
right, to look up to Esther as some virtuous woman, because we just don't know all of her character very well. We know what she did in her position, and we can learn a lot of things about that. But it's like, trying to tell your sons to live up to the character of David, while also, you gotta, if you gotta be a warrior like that and kill, you know what I'm saying? We don't tell our sons to that they have to be physical fighters in the army of God in that sense, and have to, have big muscles and they have to be trained in slings and arrows and have to attack bears and lions, and stuff like that. But we look at the character and the thing, David being a man after God's own heart. So it's kind of like that, in a sense. I think you get what I'm saying. I hope I didn't make that screwy or sound like it doesn't make sense. You get what I'm getting? This look from Penny, like, okay, wait a minute.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not at all.
Because with David too, his position as king, I mean, we know that he abused it. Okay, and so we have to just be careful. But we also know his character we know a lot more about David's character than we do know about Esther's character. I guess that's maybe the point I'm trying to make.
I was thinking,
with
Esther,
Esther,
without this and this and this.
Yeah.
Don't
The only
this,
one
but
that
be
we
like
can,
David.
the only person that we can, is Jesus, of course, that we can 100% emulate without, flaw. But the main point I want to make is that with Esther, it's not so much about character here, but about her position of influence and what we can learn from that. Okay. Maybe I should have thought that more through before I wrote it on my paper. Okay, so then lastly, just really quickly, I thought about this. So could Esther have asked for a pardon for Haman?
Yeah, like, could she have been like, oh no, it's not what you think?
Yes, when the king walked in
Right.
with him on her couch,
Yeah.
could she have
'Cause I wondered that
said
too.
something
You know,
to, rectify, correct the situation, that he's not attacking me, he's just pleading for his life. Even when she goes in and gets an audience with the king the first time, or the second time, or the third time, could she have requested a pardon for Haman?
it doesn't say it's him all 3 times.
In other words, was it wrong for her to not show pity or forgiveness toward Haman? Yeah, so is pity always a virtue?
No.
Justice.
Is the lack of it always a character flaw? This is hard for us as women, I think, sometimes. We tend to be a little more compassionate toward people, animals, than maybe men are naturally. Just in a
Once
very,
you cross a point.
yeah, just in a very broad sense here. And so I think sometimes we might be expected to always show that kind of pity. And if we don't, then there's something wrong with us, right? But I think the key here is, of course, justice. I don't think that pity or forgiveness trumps
Well, then it kind of
justice.
goes back to King Saul, who
Yeah.
spared Agag.
He
He was
showed
told not to.
either for
He did,
greed or
but-
out of pity. I'm not sure how. I think out of
For
greed is why he
whatever
did it.
reason,
Right.
It
Yeah.
has
God's
repercussions
plan,
for a long
I
time.
think so.
Yeah.
He's out here building 50-cubit gallows.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's his
at some
intention.
point,
He's
Yeah,
not
it's
reading
kinda
all
like-
the list.
It's kind of like, do you believe in, the death penalty? There's times, yeah. there's
Yeah.
other times.
There's a greater good here,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And there's always a greater good that we need to be looking out for when we're faced with various situations in our
And they were
lives.
gonna make this big example out of Vashti for her horrible
Yeah.
offense, so,
Sure.
you know.
Yeah, back
I
then,
don't know,
that's
it has to have
it
that-
seemed back in those days.
You know, when the
You
king
did
walks
today, you
in,
did
he's
more.
probably still torn. How am I gonna get myself out of this?
We are.
And he sees
That's
Haman
exactly,
laying there,
yeah.
I got you. You
Yeah.
were trying to get
Yeah, it
my
didn't
queen.
matter.
It didn't matter.
Maybe
Didn't
she
matter. I mean,
was.
what I mean is, it
Yeah.
didn't matter what the king was thinking or what he had
Right,
decided out in the
exactly.
garden.
But it was
As soon as
kinda-
he walked
yeah,
in, yeah.
Kind of an out. Hey,
Yeah.
she's
now
already
I got
asked,
you.
she's already petitioned him for
Yeah,
something huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
You might
Yeah.
just, for her, it could have been a thought of, I'm not going to push this.
Yeah, just.
Right.
But some
Just let it
people,
happen.
I guess I'm asking all of this, I'm playing a little
Some
bit
people say
of devil's advocate
Yeah,
here, because
exactly.
some people will say she was wrong for not asking for
No,
pardon.
No, no.
I don't agree with that at all,
Me either.
obviously, but yeah.
It wouldn't have crossed my
Anyway,
mind.
but we're faced with that a lot in our
Oh my
society
gosh,
today.
Even our personal lives,
Just
not to
love
this
'em.
extent, but yeah, there's a lot of.
I
times
mean,
when
the whole Jesus gets us, Jesus washed people's feet. That
Yes,
the whole undertone of that is a misunderstanding
Yeah.
of a whole lot of things. But anyway, yeah, we get
I
it.
can be very judgmental.
What's that?
I said I can be very judgmental.
We do want to practice righteous judgment, though. Okay, right? And there's nothing wrong with righteous judgment, but that has to be dictated and defined by God's word, not just some personal judgment that we think that's not good, or we think that's wrong, or we think that's bad, or we think this is great, or we don't think. It isn't up to that. It isn't up to how we feel about it. Okay, well, that's really all I have for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to class. Next week, there will be no class because I will not be here. Clint is speaking in Alabama, and so I'm going with him. So we'll be gone next week. And then our next class I have here is March 19. That'll be on Esther chapter 8. And then the last class will be March 26. And that'll be on Esther 9 and 10. So we'll just have 2 more classes after this one, but no class next week. That's the most important thing. No class next week. All right. Let me think if I had anything else. I don't think so. Anybody have anything else? No? Good? All right. Super good. What do we? Oh, good. Okay, well, I don't have anybody leading a prayer today. Nobody signed up. We ended our list. I will be happy to take a volunteer, or I can lead us in one. Doesn't matter. Any volunteers for? You can do it again? Okay, super good. Well, that's.
You need something?
It's all good.
Pray for prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again so much for the opportunity to even just gather without fear, to learn more about your word. We're grateful for anything that we're able to glean, any kind of knowledge from the book of Esther, and definitely grateful for Veronica and her time put into this and the willingness to teach us and lead us and guide us. I pray that we take the things that we've learned, be able to discern righteous judgment, make good decisions, be a light for people, and always help us to remember the things that we learn in these classes, and take them and use them and guide our friends, our family, and our children. Thank you again for the ladies and their ability to set aside other things and be here and to gather together and learn together. It's in your Son's holy name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Haley.
She shuts that off. I have got a bunch, the lady who does my